Okay, thank you. Shouldn't say thank you to the organizers because I'm one of the organizers. But anyways, thanks to Marcus for helping us to organize the conference. Thanks to all of you that are here today to present your papers and to discuss. So this paper is joint work with Sofia Bauduco and Diego Saravia from the Central Bank, and I should read this. The views expressed in this paper are our own and do not reflect the views of the Central Bank of Chile or its board. Should be there, but okay. So the title of the paper says what we do in the paper is capital flows, macro-prudential policies, and capital controls. Right? So we will try to see what the effect of macro-prudential policies and capital controls on capital flows, and empirically. Okay? Maybe we should have said that in the title. So today, one of the main topics is financial stability, and especially for developing countries, one source of vulnerability is our capital flows. And also one of the main topics here today and tomorrow will be whether monetary policy should target explicitly financial stability beyond the price target, the inflation target. And so as Governor Marcel said, this, in the case of capital flows, monetary policy can have the opposite effect, right? So, but there are another instruments that can be used to manage capital flows. Obviously, capital controls, and those will be one of the instruments we will be considering. And other maybe more they will have an indirect effect, macro-prudential policies, okay? But these are also very, it is interesting to see, to explore the effect of macro-prudential policies on capital flows, also because, as you know, there have been increasingly used in, not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries, right? So this is, you can see the trend here for developed countries, and it is, so it's something that has been implemented increasingly, and to see how they affect the capital flows may be interesting. And on the right, you see capital controls. In that case, there is a clear tendency. Developing countries use much more these instruments than developed countries. And by the way, I'm considering only the years that we will be using in the empirical work. Okay, so what we do is to empirically explore the relationship between macro-prudential policies, capital controls, and capital flows. To do that, we exploit new data on macro-prudential policies and capital controls. And one interesting thing about this data is that in the case of macro-prudential policies is that we can distinguish between the institution that to which the policy is implemented, okay? And we, of course, there is a lot of endogeneity here. There is reverse causality. To solve that problem is beyond the scope of the paper, but we try to at least partially address the effect of reverse causality, and at least to know if the direction of the effect that we find are contaminated by the reverse causality. Okay. So what are the main results? In the case of macro-prudential policies, the effect differs between the group of countries that we consider. So the effect in general will be different between developed and developing countries, and on the institution affected, okay? And in that case, it will be different if the macro-prudential policy is imposed to financial institutions or to the borrower that is. Okay, so the results, The macroprudential policy on borrowers, I will define in 2 slides what that means, but if the macroprudential policy is imposed on borrowers, then we find that capital inflows will be affected negatively, okay, in the case of developing countries. But if the macroprudential policy is imposed on financial institutions, well, we will find that it will affect negatively capital inflows to developed countries, but we find that they will affect positively capital inflows to developing countries, okay? So there will be a difference between macroprudential policies imposed on borrowers and financial institutions, and a difference if we consider developed or developing countries. And we also find that the positive effect on developing countries doesn't mean that total credit will go up with the macroprudential policy. Actually, is the opposite effect. So even though this policy affects positively capital inflows, it affects negatively domestic credit. Okay? So we argue, so as I said, this is an empirical paper, but we argue that this result may be in line with the carry trade hypothesis, in which imposing restrictions to the financial sector will give incentives to non-financial firms to borrow abroad and bring resources to the economy. We also see if the effect is contingent on institutions and financial development, and we find that it is contingent, but still the group effect persists. Okay, so beyond the level of financial development, beyond the quality of institutions, there is a different effect for developing and developed countries. In the case of capital controls, we find a negative effect, but very weak. In some extensions, we find a significant effect, but I will not focus on those extensions, but we find in the paper that the volatility, for instance, or equity flows will be working with bond flows in the present. I will show you the result with bond flows. But with equity flows, we find a negative and significant effect of capital controls. But anyways, as I will show, we don't have too much variability in terms of capital controls, so we trust much more on the effects of macroprudential policies. Okay, so the related literature, well, there is a large literature on capital controls and capital flows. Nicolas is in the list. In the case of macroprudential policies and capital flows, there is a growing literature, empirical literature. We are closer to Bruno et al. They ran similar regressions, but for a group of Asian countries only. We use almost 40 countries, developed and developing countries. And there are some details that may be important. We use time effects, which we think is very important in this case, to control for the global cycle. And as I told you, we'll try to address the problem of, partially address the problem of endogeneity. And given the result, the paper is also related to this literature that shows that non-financial institutions are having a very important role in bringing resources to emerging economies. Okay, for the data, we will use capital flows from the IMF, and we will use the variable that we will use is the flow scaled by the stock in T-1, okay? In the case of macroprudential policies, this new data is not constructed by us, but this is new data from Cerruti and others. They consider 12 measures of macroprudential policies, and they construct an index. If some country has some of these policies in place, then the index will have will increase in 1 unit. And as I told you, this is something that we will try to exploit. They split these measures into those imposed on borrowers, which are those 2, and measures imposed on financial institutions, that are the remaining 10 measures, okay? So we will take those indexes and put them in our regressions. And then we also have this data on capital controls constructed by Fernandez and others. In this case, the index will take the value of 1 if there is a policy in place, 0 otherwise, and they distinguish between controls imposed on resident and on non-resident, and we will also try to distinguish in our regressions those 2 indexes. Okay, for the data, so we will using data from 2004 to 2013. We have 39 countries, and 21 will be developed. For capital inflows, you can see that the mean capital inflow is 1.5% of the stock in developed countries, 2.3%, and it is a little more volatile in developing than in developed countries. And for the Macro-Prudential index, you can see that you can see that 17 countries have one of these measures in place in the sample. 10 of them developing, 7 of them developed. This is for borrowers, and this is for financial institutions. 34 countries have one in place. What is important for us is that these measures need to be implemented during the period that we are analyzing, because we will exploit variability inside for each country. So countries that changed their index, this means implemented a policy during the period, are 9 only, and 17 for financial institutions. Okay? So anyways, we think that we have enough countries to get some results, which is not totally the case in the case of in the case of capital controls, where you can see, as I said, it's mostly developing countries that use this instrument, and also there is no so many countries that show a change in the index during the period we analyze. Okay, and actually we will not be able to identify an effect for developed countries once we try to apply this strategy to try to address for endogeneity problems. This is the specification. So capital flows, quarterly bonds capital inflows will be a function of a country fixed effect and a quarter fixed effect. Okay, so we think that's very important to, in the case of capital flows, to control for the global cycle. And some country-specific controls that are usually used in this type of exercises. Okay, so basically total and short-term debt and reserves. Then we have our 4 indexes: Macro-Prudential, capital controls for borrowers, for financial institutions, and capital controls for non-residents and for residents. Those are our 4 variables, indexes, that, and we are interested on those coefficients, right? And then, to try to minimize the effect of reverse causality, we also include a dummy for each of these indexes. That and these dummies take a value of 1 for every country year pair where the index changes. Okay, so basically what this do, I can illustrate the idea here. This is the average. This is the average of inflows going to developing countries around the year a capital control is implemented, which is at time 0. Okay, so you can see that initially capital flows go up, and this is probably because of reverse causality, right? So there are too many capitals coming to the economy, so I impose the capital control. But then, after the first year, capital inflows go down, and at least we think that there will be less reverse causality there, okay, after period 0. So we will be focusing only on what happened the year after the policy is implemented, and this is why we will control for this dummy, because this dummy will take the value 1 at this point, okay? Of course, this is the average. We are not controlling for anything else here, but at least we will, we should have, we claim that the reverse causality should be less important when we control for that dummy, okay? This is different than using lags, because we are still assuming that there is a contemporaneous effect of the control on capital flows. So the easiest way to see it is if you implement a policy only one period. If I use a lag, then I will try to find a response in the period after. In this case, I cannot identify any effect, right? Because just in that period is just a dummy that we will take in the effects, okay? Okay, so these are our baseline estimations. Let me show you first the case where we don't control for the dummy, for the time that the indexes change. You can see here that if you use all the countries, we don't see any significant effect. But if we split the sample into developed and developing country, we start finding some significant effect, right? Now, our baseline specification, including the dummies, the effect is the same when, the significance pattern of the coefficient is the same when using all the countries together, when including all the countries, but it changes when we split again. It changes when we split the sample into developed and developing country. And you can see here that the coefficient change. Here we had a positive effect of capital controls on capital inflows for developed countries. Now we don't have that result because it was based only in countries that imposed control only for one period. So probably it was very contaminated by reverse causality. And you can see here that we don't have results because all of that effect will be captured by this dummy, okay? In the case of emerging countries, the effects are, the coefficients are a little larger, but they're not significant anyways. But we think our main result comes from macroprudential policies, and as I said, we trust more on them because we have more variability. And in that case, we find that macroprudential policies imposed on borrowers, as I said in the beginning, have a negative effect on capital inflows to developing countries, but those imposed on financial institutions have different effect depending on the country. Okay, so for developed countries, it is negative, and for developing is positive and significant. Okay, and if you compare this coefficient with the coefficient without controlling for the dummy, is larger. This means that, so we claim that then the positive effect, it may be affected by reverse causality, but probably the fact that it's positive is not because of that. Because in that case, we will find a higher coefficient here, because for that coefficient, the time that you implement the policy will be, that effect will be included. This is the same graph that I showed before, but for MPI to financial institutions. And you can see that after this is the average without controlling for any other factor. And you can see that in developing countries, after this measure is implemented, you see that the inflows go up and inflows will go down in developed countries, okay? So in that case, the policy is implemented at 0 and remains in place for the subsequent periods. Okay, so we want to know if that effect, that positive effect, comes from substitution, meaning that it's just that given that the financial sector is more restricted, then the flows come from abroad instead of coming from locally from and intermediated by the financial sector. And to explore that, we, instead of having capital flows as the dependent variable, we'll have domestic credit. Okay, so this is the baseline that I showed you before. This is the same regression, but with domestic credit on the left-hand side. And you can see here that the effect is negative on domestic credit. Okay, so even though imposing these controls lead to higher capital inflows, it has a negative effect on total domestic credit in the economy. Now, we would like to understand why we observe these different signs, and the suspects are institutions are financial development. So, okay, so initially we thought that we will be able to explain these different signs with these indexes, but we couldn't actually. So if you use all the, so here I'm showing an interaction between a variable, an index for the quality of institutions. In this case, it's the quality of government, the effectiveness of government, and interaction with the level of financial development, okay? In both cases, these variables are fixed for the whole sample, so the variation is only due to the indexes. And I'm showing you just the interaction terms, okay? So if we use all the countries, then the interaction term is negative, and this is what we would expect, right? Given that we observe that for developed countries, the coefficient is negative, and for developing countries, it is positive. So we should find a negative relationship. But when we split the sample into developed and developing, the sign is different, it's positive. Sometimes it's significant, sometimes not. But to show you what this means, I can graph the results. So this red line is the result when you use all the countries. And it is negative, the slope, okay? So countries with better institutions have a negative effect of MPI on inflows, and the same happens if we consider financial development. But when we split the sample, then we get different slopes. This is for developing countries. This is for developed countries, okay? So let me focus on the case of financial development. This means that if only consider developing countries, we have a positive effect between financial development and the effect of MPI on capital flows, okay? So this may, and thus the same happens with the developed countries, but it is not significant, okay? So this means that there is something beyond the financial development that makes the effect of these policies different, okay? And maybe it's like an inverted U here that we could capture with a nonlinear specification, but we haven't done that yet, okay? But anyways, so we interpret this as saying that in emerging countries there is carry trade opportunities, and those are stronger when the financial system is more developed, maybe because the MPI have more effect on the financial sector, and this explains why this positive effect inside the developing countries. Okay, so the index for MPI that we have used is at an annual frequency. The variable for capital flows is a quarterly frequency. There is an index also for quarterly MPI, but there is fewer observations. You can see here. There are some countries that go away when we use the quarterly MPI index. But anyways, we would like to show that the effects are robust when we use this index, and actually the effects are stronger. Okay, the size of the coefficient is not comparable between the two because the index are constructed in a different way, but the signs are there and they become much significant. Okay, so that to show the robustness. Well, I have time to show you some additional results. Given that I haven't said anything about capital controls, when we use volatility instead of the inflow, we find actually some significant effect of capital controls here. Okay. We also explore how the effect interact with some macro conditions. We find some effects there, but they are not very illustrative of the mechanism that we are exploring. And also we find that we show that the effect, this positive and negative effect, it is not, it is not, it is robust also if we split the sample into two periods, okay, before and after the crisis. We still find this pattern of negative and positive coefficient if we split the sample in 2007 or in 2008. Okay, so let me conclude. In this paper, we study the effect of macroprudential policies and capital controls on capital inflows in developed and developing countries. Our main result, and we think that the result that we emphasize the most, because as I said, we think the index allows us to believe on the effect, is that the MPP target to financial institutions impact bond inflows negatively in developed economies and positively in developing ones. It is robust and survives when we control for the year in which the policy is implemented, and we do that to partially account for reverse causality. We think this is in line with the carry trade hypothesis because of two reasons. One is that we don't find a positive effect on total credit in the economy, and second is that it is a function of the level of financial development of the country. Okay, that's it. Thank you.